them that I'm on blood pressure medicine, because otherwise I would probably be stroking out right now. But anywho, we're going to get through this. We're going to get through this. If you have your Bibles and you're not there already, if you would, make your way to the Old Testament, to the book of Hosea, and to chapter 11. That's where we're going to be camping out today. And the reason I want to talk about Hosea 11 is because Matthew uses Hosea 11 as kind of a foundation for his account of the gospel of Jesus the Christ. And I kind of figured that if it's important enough for Matthew to use, then it should be important enough for us to read through and to try to better understand. Yeah? So that's kind of the goal for today. Hosea 11 is not a long chapter. It's only about maybe 11 verses long. And the story arc that goes through these 11 verses, as we're going to see, can best be summarized kind of like this. Scott, you got me? A faithful, loving, and righteous God is unequally yoked to a partner who is unfaithful, unloving, and unrighteous. We watch as he wrestles over what to do about his unfaithful partner and what effect his decision will have on their relationship. So, in other words, if you're the kind of person who loves like romantic drama kind of movies, then you should be in hog heaven today. Anywho, so hopefully, has everyone had enough time to make their way to Hosea 11? I hope so. If not, keep looking. It's not going anywhere. And if you don't have your Bibles, the word should be up here. So, without further ado, let's dive in, right? Verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him. And out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Let's stop right there for a second. The first thing you need to know about the Old Testament prophets is that the whole lot of them are just really weird, right? And what I mean by that is that they see things and they see the world very differently than how everyone else sees it. And this shines through in their writings because they love using things like metaphor and simile, like analogies and symbolism and word plays on words and double speech and all this kinds of stuff. And we have an example of that in verse 1. Because what Hosea writes is, out of Egypt I called my son. But what he also means is, out of slavery and death I called my son. Now, why does God call Israel out of slavery and death? Simply put, it was never God's intention for slavery and death to play any kind of a role in the human experience, much less in creation as a whole. Slavery and death entered into the world only through the machinations of the deceiver. Right? And so he sees these people who are living a life that he did not intend for them to have or to live and to experience. And so he busts them out of there to try and give them the life he did intend for them to have, which is the opposite of slavery and death, freedom and life. Okay? But the tragedy of this whole situation is that the more God tries to give freedom and life to the Israelites, the more the Israelites run away. They reject it and instead run back into slavery and death. Which leaves us as readers here just kind of scratching our heads thinking, is this a nation of morons? Right? Because who in their right mind would choose slavery and death when you could just as easily have freedom and life? Right? And so Hosea nods and agrees and he says, yeah. Why would you choose slavery and death? Because you see, for Hosea, not only is Egypt metaphorical, but so is Israel. And so what he says here is, dear reader, when you were a child, God loved you, and he called you out of slavery and death. But the more you were called, the more you went away. Because if we're honest with ourselves, each and every one of us have an Egypt of some kind in our lives. Now, my Egypt may be different from your Egypt. Your Egypt may be very different from everyone else's Egypt. But all of us, if we're honest, we have an Egypt. We have something in our lives that we just find ourselves very easily drawn toward, instead of, even though that thing is antithetical to the life and freedom that God desires for us. Okay? So, let me ask you, dear readers, what is your Egypt? Yeah? Meditate on that as we keep reading. Yeah? Verse 3. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. Now, God is a great deal many things. There is also a great deal many things God is not. And one of the things that God is not is an absentee father. From the very beginning, He has known you, right? When you were being formed in the womb, I knew you. Right? So from your very first steps, God has been with you every single moment through the highs and the lows, trying to provide for you the freedom and the life He always intended for you, even though you keep running to Egypt. And why does He do that? What's the point? Does He not get the hint we don't want it? Well, it's because He loves you unconditionally. And it's because of that unconditional love that He allows it to rain on the just and the unjust alike. Tracking with me? How you doing? You doing good? Okay. So, let's keep going. Verse 4. I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws, and I bent down to them and fed them. Now, personally, I love verse 4. Because I have a dog, and I love my dog. Everyone else, he's just a dog. But to me, he's there's my dog. That's Otto von Big Mark. That's my good boy. I love him. You know, how can you not with that face and the big old pit bull jowls? You know, but to everyone else, he's just a dog. But to me, he's more than just a dog. He is my son. And I treat him as if he were my son. He gets all the treats and all that right? And so therefore, I am incredibly thankful that God thinks of and loves me the same way I think of and love my dog. Tracking with me? Okay. So in these first 4 verses then, Hosea paints us a picture of a God who has a very sincere and a very deep love for Israel. But out of that sincere and deep love, He's also experiencing a very sincere and deep sadness and pain. Because the more He puts into the relationship, the more they keep throwing it back in His face. And what do we call that in modern parlance, if not a kind of toxic relationship? Right? Tracking with me? So, God's experiencing this, and as time goes on, His patience wears thin, and His sadness turns into anger. And that's what we see next in verse 5. They shall not return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria shall be their king. Now, I've talked about Egypt. Let me talk about Assyria for a minute. And apologies ahead of time if you have a weak stomach. Because when an Assyrian army came to your town and your city and conquered it, if you were lucky, you died in the fighting. Because otherwise, what they would do is they'd round up all the survivors, lead them out into the fields around the city, and they'd skin you alive, head to toe. And they'd take your skins and drape them over the walls of the city, and they take your corpses and pile them up in the gates of the city. So that when the army leaves and everyone from the surrounding villages come to assess the situation, they're met with that gruesome sight. Now, for the Jews, this is a double tragedy, because to even get into the city, you first have to move the corpses out of one of the gates. And according to the terms of the covenant, when you touch a dead body, you become ritually unclean. And what that means is that you are completely and utterly cut off from God. You can no longer tell God sorry. You cannot tell God thank you. You cannot ask God for help in whatever situation you got going on in your lives. It is as if you yourself have been decreated. What a terrible, vile, mean, awful thing to do to followers of Yahweh. And yet, Israel looks at Assyria and how they do things and says, we want that. They've got it going on. That seems like a good idea to us. And again, you're scratching your heads. Are you idiots? Because how in the world does skinning people alive seem to be in any kind of way a good thing compared to the freedom and life that God desires for you? Right? And we see this and get confused. God sees this and he gets angry. And he says, fine, that's what you want. You can have it. But here's what your life's going to look like now. Because they have refused to return to me, the sword shall rage against their cities, consume the bars of their gates, and devour them because of their own counsels. My people are bent on turning away from me, and though they call out to the Most High, he shall not raise them up at all. You kind of hear the anger and the frustration in those words? If not, let me try and put it to you this way. You ever been in a situation where someone you love gets involved in something that you know can only end badly for them? And because you love them, you try to tell them, you try to warn them so that whatever that bad thing is, it doesn't happen to them, right? But the more you go warn and tell them, they just want to argue with you about it. And eventually, if it goes on long enough, you just run out of patience. You get frustrated and you tell them, fine. But when all this blows up in your face, don't come crying back to me. Right? If you have been there, then you can kind of understand the emotions and the frustrations that God is experiencing here. Right? Assyria, terrible people. And we think they're awful and whatever, and we're looking, how could you do this? And Hosea looks at us and says, yeah. How could you go after Assyria? Because we have an Egypt in our lives, we also have an Assyria in our lives. We have people, situations, things, whatever, that we are constantly trying to butter ourselves up to and get closer with, even though they themselves have no interest at all in our well-being. And so we rush to them and again ignore the God whose number one desire is for us to be the humans he always designed us to be and intended for us to be. You tracking with me? So here we see God's sadness turns into anger. And the thing the psalmists tell us about God's anger is that it is mighty and it is overwhelming and that there are none who can withstand it. But the psalmists also tell us that God's anger lasts but for a moment, whereas his favor lasts for a lifetime. And that's what we see happening next in verse 8. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart recoils within me, my compassion grows warm. I will not execute my burning anger, I will not again destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not a man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. There's not a lot of anger in these words like there was in the last section, was there? There's some like mercy and a little bit of love like was in that very first section. But before we dive into that, let me talk about Admah and Zeboim for a minute. Because odds are, if you're not a Bible nerd, you probably have no clue who or what Admah and Zeboim are, right? Luckily for y'all, or maybe unluckily, I am a Bible nerd. So let me show you. This comes from Deuteronomy 29. The whole land burned out with brimstone and salt, nothing sown and nothing grown, where no plant can sprout, an overthrow like that of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and wrath. Now, you may not know Admah and Zeboim, but I dare say you are in some ways familiar with the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah. Two cities in which the people were so vile and horrible and miserable that God's only option for interaction with them was to literally nuke them from orbit, right? Fire from the sky. And yet he says in verse 10, Scott? Okay. And yet he says in verse 10 to Israel, to his covenant partner, to his son, how can I make you like them? How can I treat you like I treated them? Which brings up some interesting questions, because if God is who he is, and if God is righteous, then he should do to Israel what he did to Sodom and Gomorrah, because Israel has become the new Sodom and Gomorrah. And yet he doesn't. He decides the exact opposite. I will not execute my burning anger. What's the deal? Is God not really who he says he is? Is he really not all that righteous? And is he willing to let some sin slide? You know, if you grease the temple offering plate a little harder than normal or whatever, right? What's going on here? You would think that would be true if God was only a righteous God. But he is not. He is righteous, but he is also loving and faithful. And it is the loving and faithful God that stands in the gap between an unrighteous people and the righteous part of God and says, hang on, big guy. I assume, roll with me. Says, hang on. How are these people evil, miserable, vile? Yes. Do they deserve to be nuked from orbit because of all their violations of the covenant? Yes. They knew what they were getting into when they signed it. But you made a promise to Abraham that through his descendants, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And don't forget, you made a promise to David that his offspring would have an eternal rule. And if you nuke these people from orbit right here, right now, you will be breaking both of those promises. You see the issue God's having now? Because if God is to be a righteous God, he needs to nuke them from orbit. But in being a righteous God, he becomes unfaithful because he breaks his promises. Whereas if God stays a faithful God and fulfills his promises, then he can't nuke them, which makes him unrighteous. So how is he going to get out of this one? How does he maintain who he is while in this awful, terrible situation, this confusing situation that Israel has put him in? The answer is in the last line. Nope, too far. I will not come in wrath. In other words, God says, fine, all right, fine. I'm not going to nuke them from orbit for now. But here's what I'm going to do, because I'm mad at them, I'm out of patience, and I'm tired of dealing with this mess. I'm going to go down there, and I'm going to fulfill my promise to Abraham, and I'm going to fulfill my promise to David. And I'm going to set up a new covenant with people who are going to love me as much as I love them. And if you don't get in that boat, then you get nuked. Now, for some of you, the puzzle pieces are clicking together because you're hearing the New Testament. And you're hearing the New Testament because now, hopefully, you're starting to see Hosea the way Matthew does. But if you're not there yet, don't worry. We still got a ways. Hopefully, we'll get you there. Yeah, so what happens after God goes down there and sorts all this out? Verse 10. They shall go after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, his children shall come trembling from the west. They shall come trembling like sparrows from Egypt, and like doves from the land of Assyria. And I will return them to their homes, declares the Lord. Now, there's several things going on here, but there's three I want to draw your attention to. Okay? First off is this word roar. Right? In the Hebrew, it is the word she'agah. Scott? Okay. When he she'agahs, his children shall come trembling. Okay? Now, she'agah is not a unique word. It's used throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. But there is one instance in particular I want you to draw your attention to, and that comes from the Psalms. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my she'agah? We see the same words right here. We all see this? Okay, Matthew sees this. Matthew studied under Jesus and followed Jesus around for 3 years. And Matthew was there when Jesus was crucified on the cross. So he takes this, makes this connection, and runs with it, right? About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus quotes Psalm 22 while he's on the cross. And what is crying out with the loud voice, if not the fancy way of saying that Jesus roared? Right? So Jesus on the cross roars out a psalm in which the psalmist himself roars. In other words, Matthew is saying, hey, dear reader, I don't have electricity. I can't build you a bright, shining, yellow, flashing neon light, but look, Jesus on the cross is the fulfillment of verse 10 somewhere. Scott, there we go. Jesus on the cross is the fulfillment. It is the roar of the Lord. It's happening. All this is happening now. So, Jesus roars on the cross. That leads us to the second thing. What happens next? The Lord... The Lord's children shall come trembling from the west, like sparrows from Egypt, and like doves from the land of Assyria. The Lord's children, plural. But in verse 1, we were talking about the Lord's child, his son, Israel, singular. You see, what Hosea is saying here is that when the Lord comes down here and sorts all this mess out, he's not just going to take care of Israel. He's going to take care of them first, but he's also going to take care of all the nations. And all the nations are going to have access to the same blessing that Israel has. In other words, through Jesus, Matthew says, God is fulfilling his promise to Abraham to bring blessing to all the nations. Now, what is that blessing? Well, it's the thing Jesus can't shut up talking about. You can't go 2 red letter sentences in the Gospels without Jesus saying something about the kingdom. It's the kingdom. Kingdom this, kingdom that, kingdom blah, 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 whatever, right? But the thing about a kingdom is it needs a king to be a kingdom. And so who's going to be the king of this kingdom? Well, God sets up Jesus to be king. Oh, by the way, Matthew says, Jesus is a descendant of David. So not only does God fulfill his promise to Abraham through Jesus, he also fulfills his promise to David through Jesus by making David's offspring, Jesus, have an eternal rule. Right? And now that brings us to the third thing. Because for a kingdom to be a good kingdom, you need people in the kingdom. Because a kingdom with no people, like, what's the point? Right? A king of one. So who are going to be the people in this kingdom? It's all the people who are going to love God as much as he loves them. It's the kingdom of the new covenant. So through Jesus, Matthew says, God is fulfilling his promises to Abraham, he fulfills his promises to David, and he sets up the new covenant relationship with people who are going to love him as much as he loves them. That's a very clever, clear, concise way of finishing up what was a terribly messy situation previously. Right? So, hang on. So that leads us to number 3, the last thing that's going to happen. After all this happens, God says he's going to return them to their homes. Now, if they come from the west, and they come from Egypt, and they come from Assyria to God, then logically their homes must be in the west, in Egypt, and in Assyria. So you would think then, is God saying that all his children are going to come to him, and then he's just going to send them right back home where they were? Doesn't really track with the logic of the story so far and what we know about Jesus. So what's God thinking here? What's he got in his head? What does he mean by I'm going to return them to their homes? The answer is a little bit hidden in Matthew's gospel, but in Luke's gospel he makes it clear as day. You know the story. Jesus is on the cross. He's got the 2 thieves on either side. And the one thief says to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus says to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." He doesn't tell the thief, "You'll be in my kingdom." He says, "You'll be in paradise." So kingdom and paradise are normally 2 different things, but in Jesus' mind, they're one and the same. Now, we've talked about kingdom. Let's talk about paradise for a minute. As Scott just threw up there a minute ago, paradise, you can't answer in English or describe what it is in English because paradise is not originally an English word. It's the Greek word paradisos spelt with English letters. So if you want to know what Jesus really told the thief on the cross, you have to translate the Greek word paradisos. But you can't, because paradisos is not a Greek word. It's the Persian word paraditsa spelt with Greek letters. So in order to know what Jesus told the thief on the cross, you have to then translate the Persian word paraditsa. And you can translate that. And when you translate that, what Jesus tells the thief is, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in the garden." In other words, in Jesus' mind, and in God's intended home for humanity, is the garden. Now, if you know Jesus, there's only one garden he can be talking about. But if you don't, no shame, let me show you. Genesis 2:8. "And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed." Where God intended for you to live is in the garden from the very beginning. The kind of life he intended you to have, the freedom and the life of that, is one in which you can walk beside him day after day in the cool of the morning, face to face. And it is that life that he intended for you, but it is that life that he stole, or that was stolen from you through the machinations of the deceiver. But now, through Jesus, you have the ability to reclaim what was previously stolen to you, to reclaim this life you were always intended to have. Tracking with me? Okay. So, how are we doing? Okay, let's wrap this up. Let's land the plane, whatever analogy you want to do. I don't know what your spiritual situations are individually. I don't know in what way Hosea or Matthew or Luke speaks into those individual situations. I don't know what your Egypt is or who your Assyria is. What I do know is that 2,000 years ago, on a hill outside Jerusalem, dying on a cross, Jesus let out a roar so loud and so powerful that it broke through space and time to reach you where you are right now. And to say, hey man, right? What's this Egypt you're running after? Who are these Assyrians? That's not who you are. That's not who you were designed to be. That's not anything what I intended for you to have. You don't have to keep running after them. You can stop and rest and embrace the freedom and the life I always intended for you to have here in the garden. Right? Now, Scott's going to cue up a song. We're going to sing some lyrics. While we do so, I would encourage you to take a self-check. Right? Who's your Egypt? Who's your Assyria? Are you still currently running toward them? Or are you embracing the rest and the life and the freedom that God intended for you? Right? If there's something going on, of course, naturally you can pray at your pew about it, but at the same time, the altar is open to you and you can come up here and pray about it. And don't forget, you don't have to do this alone. There's a whole room of people in here that are all embracing the rest, or trying to embrace the rest that Eden provides, that God intended for us. And they're all willing to help you out as well. So, Scott, if you would, the song, if you would stand with me, let's sing.